Welcome to Liberty Action Alert with Greg Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C. A program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking to kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Greg Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C., and friends of the program all across the country. I'm Greg Seltz. Welcome to Liberty Action Alert. Today on our program, Tim Goeglein, Vice President of Government Communications for Focus on the Family, a good friend of the LCRL, and we're talking to him today because he is an author, many times over, but now his latest book, Toward a More Perfect Union. Welcome, Tim.
It's really a pleasure to be with you, and it's a great honor, Greg, in all of our wonderful dialogue and discussion. One of the things that you and I share is a love of history and a love of culture. And in writing the book, looking at our cultural, historical landscape, and in preparation, research, writing of this book over the course of the last 3 years, it's rather astonishing, some of the realities that we're finding in our own country. It's very sobering, and that's why I spend the first third of the book really assessing, what does the rising generation of Americans know or don't know, and based on that, what is the future of liberty in our nation?
Well, when you think about the founding fathers, this is for a moral, religious, self-governing people. And what we're seeing right now is people don't even understand the framework of not only their liberties, but the framework of their responsibilities. And so I love your title, great title, Toward a More Perfect Union. But that was such a basic understanding of what we were trying to accomplish. I mean, Lincoln, we're going all the way back to the founding fathers. I thought that's what was compelling all of us. We were proud of what we were or what we have and the foundational principles, and we're moving forward. Even Martin Luther King was talking that way, that he wanted us to live up to our principles. So I guess such a title reveals to me that there's an underlying issue, that there are many who would argue there's no point to this union and that we need to really destroy it and start all over again. And I think you're kind of addressing that. So talk about the impetus of why you wanted to write this book.
Well, first, I appreciate you asking about the title. I've done a number of interviews, in the book launch, but I've only had one person ask me about the title, which of course is taken from the preamble to the Constitution, Toward a More Perfect Union, and of course the subtitle, The Moral and Cultural Case for Teaching the Great American Story. And so, if I may say, Greg, it all begins here. I was working for nearly 8 years at the White House for George W. Bush. I was a special assistant to the president and the deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. And during those years, on 2 separate occasions, I was very honored and privileged to have lengthy conversations with the late great American historian David McCullough. He shared with me that one of his greatest fears was that the rising generation of Americans did not understand the American story, because he was seeing the lack of historical and civic education in America, and it really deeply disturbed him. And the reason I mention that, Greg, in light of your great question, is because in researching this book, I read, digested, absorbed piles of empirical research and data. And I could use many examples, but just for the advantage of your listeners, I want to cite one survey that was taken of public high school students in the United States. And I was particularly interested in this very large data set because the test they were given was the U.S. citizenship test for legal immigrants. In other words, this is kind of the floor of what new citizens need to know in order to pass the test.
Right.
Now, I'm hoping that most of our listeners are sitting down because these statistics are genuinely shocking. Yet, may I say, only 1 in 4 public high school students could name George Washington as the first president of the United States.
Right.
Barely 1 in 10% knew that there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and less than 30% knew that the president of the United States of America heads the executive branch of government. And when you add all the data sets together, only 3%, Greg, were able to answer 6 out of the 10 questions, which of course is the passing score for the U.S. citizenship test. So I think the conclusion is that these students would now be in their early to mid 30s, based on when the test was taken in 2009. They're casting votes, they're rallying, they're running, holding political office. Yet it seems to me, realistically, we can say, not because we're being highly critical, but we're basing it on what the data tells us. Many of them, not all, are woefully ignorant about our history and our system of government. And this would have confounded our founders in a very deep way.
Well, and the other thing too, I always talk about this in one of the lectures that I give. I start off by saying, "What is American exceptionalism? Tell me." And almost everybody now shirks back from that. I would say probably 50, 75 years ago, people would have had an opinion, and it would have been like, America's a pretty good place, not perfect, pretty good place. But I finally said to them, the founding fathers put 2 principles out that no other nation has. Number one was obviously the dignity of humanity because of our being created by God. And I suppose the Western world has some semblance of that, but America more specifically. And then here's the other thing. This is what makes us so unique. They also talked about the depravity of humanity, and that power, if it actually is localized in a government structure of coercion, sinners can do all kinds of bad things to each other. So they limited the government. That's why the government has a tripartite government, all these things. Well, not only do we not know the principles, we don't even know why they put 3, executive branch, legislative branch, legal branch. We don't even know why they did all that. And they did it because of those 2 principles. And so I always tell them, man, it's pretty tough to think that we're full of ourselves when we say the 2 principles is dignity and depravity. And therefore they wanted us to be moral and self-governing and religiously motivated. So back to your teaching, I actually do think there's a movement to do this, that this is not by accident, that people are actually teaching this ignorance and teaching against the foundational principles for a reason. And I think you make that point in your book.
Thank you. Yes, I do. And it's part of the golden narrative. And I'd like to pick up on that if I may, because this is one of the principal motivating factors in my writing toward a more perfect union. Point 1, to your point 1, that's why I wanted to make a moral and cultural case for teaching America and what we're about. Now, what does that mean practically in light of what you said? I'd like to disaggregate that. I think we can conclude that the breakdown in history and civic education, Greg, is directly tied to many of the ills that we face in 21st century America. What are those? They're incivility, they're bad leaders, they're cultural decay, cancel culture. I know one of your favorite presidents, one of my favorite presidents is Dwight David Eisenhower, one of the greatest men we have ever produced in American history. He, in his 1953 inaugural address, it's a powerful gem of a speech. He says, a people that values its privileges above its principles soon loses both. What does it mean practically? It means we are living through a time when Father Sarah, this enormously important person who founded California, has been totally erased. And by the way, a very serious Christian. George Washington, erased. Thomas Jefferson, erased. Abraham Lincoln, erased. Winston Churchill, erased. Now, why?
You said, you also said Ulysses S. Grant, and when I saw that one, when the quotes that the black leaders were saying of the day were saying about Grant were so powerful, and like you said, but they toppled his statue too.
They did, and in fact, Ulysses S. Grant has a central part in my book, not only before the Civil War, not only during the Civil War, but a very highly underrated president. And in the area of his presidency in race relations, etc.,
Right.
a monumental figure. Actually, he deserves to be thought of rightfully as one of our first presidents to proactively demonstrate and call for the kind of civil rights and a civil rights movement that we would all be very proud of.
Right.
And the reason, Greg, that I think that both of your points are so central is about deliberate, the deliberate
That's
sense
the word.
of undermining the American story. And so I devote an entire chapter to Howard Zinn. This is a person who every single parent and grandparent in America should know by name, because Howard Zinn is the architect of much of the propaganda and disinformation that has now impacted and terribly impacted 3 generations of Americans. His goal was not to teach the facts, but to teach opinions. And the opinions that he sought to teach were his own, not history. He said that he wanted, I'm quoting him, he said he wanted to transform American history. And he said his goal was both to denounce Western civilization and to convince students to reject it. He said it was marred by the religion of popes, the government of kings, and the frenzy of money. This kind of neo-Marxism was very craftily, synthesized and translated. And here's why people should know him, because he authored the most important, the most widely published, read, and used in American schools histories of the United States. Not only for advanced students, quite the opposite. Howard Zinn was aiming at primary and secondary students. And I'm very sorry to say, his version of history is now the dominant one taught in our education system. He was very effective.
Well, and it goes right to, and here's a guy who's representing a polity that he says is more pure. In fact, they would actually argue it's not that we have a more perfect union. We have the perfect union. They actually teach that. I've read their stuff, but then they don't account for the fact that 110 to 120 million of their own citizens were butchered under these these perfect unions and the things like that. I loved your quote. You even said, Arthur Schlesinger, when he was talking about the disuniting of America, you said this is by design. And I think that's well documented in your book. Well, listen, you basically challenge people to learn our history, learn it, to see it and to be able to critically analyze and understand it. And so there are fundamentals that have made this the greatest society, at least the freest society in the world for more and more people. And we need to learn to celebrate that, honor that, warts and all. And I guess I saw this when I was interviewing the curator of the Magna Carta, or at least having a dialogue with him. Here was a guy who was the curator of the Magna Carta, and all he talked about was its deficiencies. And I thought, here's a document that was the very beginning of standing against the powerful to such a degree that you as a citizen someday would have the kind of powers you have in America, or at least the rights and opportunities. And this guy couldn't say anything really good about the original Magna Carta. And I thought, and he's the curator. It's not like he's not a critic. That's his job. And I think that's where we're at with the Bill of Rights. If we lose these, you will not refine them because they're unique in history. So again, you talk about finally coming back to some of these foundational principles. Elucidate some of that for us, from your book.
I think we are now duty bound. I think it's a moral principle that we ask the kind of questions, Greg, of the following. What kind of a country do we want 50 years from now?
Right.
How about that? What kind of a country do we want 100 years from now? It seems to me that we must stand up to this lack of teaching and propaganda if we are actually now to preserve the United States of America. I quote Barry Weiss. I think that she matches her name. She's wise. She said, keeping the spirit of liberty alive in an age of creeping illiberalism is nothing less than our moral obligation. Everything depends on it. And I think that's it. What do we want? I think what we want is the following. We want an informed citizenry who is equipped with the right facts. I know that you admire and esteem Ronald Reagan, and so do I.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote in the book as well, perhaps the greatest speech of his second administration, when he sounded the alarm in 1989. The president said that an informed patriotism is what we want. We've got to do a better job of getting across that America is freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise. and what I love about Ronald Reagan is that he knew that freedom was rare and that it was special, that it's fragile, that it needs protection. And he made it very clear that if we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. He was warning us, Greg, of the implications of what can only be called the eradication of the American memory.
Right.
that would result if we stay on this trajectory. And in my time at Focus on the Family, I travel about a third of the time. And I promise, north, south, east, west, wherever I go, when it comes to that moment, kind of after you're done making your remarks, you open it up for questions, comments, concerns, etc., almost with pinpoint predictability. Whether you're in Oklahoma or Massachusetts or California or your home state of Michigan, people will say something like the following. One, I've never been more concerned about my country than I am now. Two, if they have children and grandchildren, they will say, and I'm particularly concerned about my children and grandchildren. And then they will say, and I don't know what to do.
Right.
And so after all these years of listening, I pray in the right sense, to these concerns, I thought to myself, those are really important points. I think I'll answer point 3. So the purpose of Toward a More Perfect Union is not just to say, here's all the problems.
Right.
Quite the opposite. I devote about 1/3 of the book to lay it out, say, here's where we're at, to flesh out what some of these concerns are, and then to spend a very large part of the book saying, and what can we do about it? Not some 50-point plan that Silicon Valley or Wall Street or Hollywood or Washington's going to impose on the country, but in a practical sense, what can we actually do to address this terrible onslaught of propaganda and misinformation?
Well, and that's where I like to go to your solutions too. And folks, just so you understand what we're talking about, I mean, the uniqueness again of the American experiment is not that it made the American government it limited that so that you as a citizen had the freedom to live your life honorably, again, from a self-disciplining, self-governing, religiously motivated perspective. So we're not advocating for here's our government solution. In some ways, we're saying the government is involved in a lot of this stuff it has no business being a part of. And I think that's what you talk about in your solutions, because you talked about the fact that there are 2 bills that are out there right now, the Civics Learning Act 101 and the
right.
Civics Secures Democracy, and they're not the answer to the problem, they're more of the problem, right?
Absolutely. Isn't it ironic? It's like the 1619 Project,
Right.
which I also eviscerate in my book.
Right.
Because the 1619 Project says that America started when the slave ships came to the coastlands of Virginia. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Our country, we all know, was born on July 4th, 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. Right. Everybody knows that. But the point of the 1619 Project is disinformation and propaganda. It's to erase the memory of America and merely to start again. And frankly, the danger with utopias is that they never work. Utopias are always dangerous. But by the way, Greg, I'm very happy to say that in the same period of time when I met one of my heroes, David McCullough, I also met my favorite living British historian, who was Paul Johnson, who just died
Right.
In the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, I've read his book.
Yes, right. His history of the Jews and his history of Christianity. They will be read 100 years from now. But what I love is his great single volume history of the United States. I'm asked, and I'm sure you are all the time, by people, what is a reliable history of the United States? But the reason I mentioned Paul Johnson, Greg, is that in the first part of his great volume on America, he says something that I think is a beautiful summation of our conversation today. He says, and I'm quoting Paul Johnson, he says, the creation of the United States of America is the greatest of all human adventures. He said, no other national story holds such tremendous lessons for the American people themselves and for the rest of mankind. That is objectively the case. Right. This is a remarkable, extraordinary country. It's not a perfect country. No. And I delineate in the book many of the chapters of our national story that are not worthy of the best of the American experience. It's okay. We can deal with that. And we have to deal with it. We're morally bound to do so. But it doesn't mean that you erase or transform the entire history of the country. We owe this to the rising generation of young Americans.
Well, and the principles, like you said, that guide us. The reason why it's not a perfect country is because we're not perfect people. And so there's always going to be challenges to even doing the right thing. Everyone today is being challenged to do the right thing in some situation. Some of you are going to do it right. Some of you are going to do it wrong. Therein lies the issue of why we're not a perfect union. But that's right. What the polity they put together to allow the most of us to actually not only strive, but live in freedom and to bless our families and to bless our communities without government coercion to the contrary. There's no place like this in the world. And so all you're saying is you will make it the best if you start to live up to the citizenship that you've been granted. So solution-wise, you say start around the table, right? Start around the table of your own homes.
Absolutely right. The best solution to this national cancer begins in our homes around the kitchen or dining room table. It does. It begins in our churches, in our parishes, in our neighborhoods. You know, I know that Chesterton is one of your favorites, as he is mine. He loved where he was from. It's an elemental role of conservatism. He said every neighborhood should have a banner. You know, I love that. We're all from someplace, you know. Right. Some of us are from farms and some of us are from the Upper West Side of New York. You know, we're all Americans. Right. But I really do believe that the battle for the soul of our nation begins in our homes, which will then hopefully, prayerfully transform our schools and restore the proper teaching of American history and civics. And I'll tell you, I am an inveterate optimist. And I'll tell you, we are living presently in the middle of a parental rebellion nationwide. And I think this is really much, much truer now than it was even 5 years ago. All of a sudden, parents, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, urban, rural, whatever, parents are waking up and they are asking excellent questions. Right. What kind of people sit on the school board? Who decides the curriculum? You know, there was a national gubernatorial race in the Commonwealth of Virginia not long ago. And a former governor was running for his old seat. And in a debate, he said to his opponent, essentially, that parents ought to butt out, that they really, ought to let the schools, decide what's best to teach the students. Well, I mean, this is principally un-American.
And it's madness.
It is. And so I think toward a more perfect union does make a moral and cultural case for the teaching of the great American story. And I do believe that there are lots of people who will want to read this and far beyond reading it, use it, employ it, use it as a tool in your toolbox to reach out to the next generation of young Americans and go tell a new generation this really extraordinary story.
I concur. And so go ahead and read that, Toward a More Perfect Union. That'll be a good start for you and your family. And also, I would just say, too, advocate for parental choice in education so you can actually send your kids to a school that actually believes these things. Thank you so much for the effort, Tim. And God bless you. I pray for great success for the book.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be on.
Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRLDC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Contained there are resources to empower your public square dynamic discipleship. Or check out our weekly Word from the Center opinion piece every Friday at facebook.com/LCRL Freedom. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Greg Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Action Alert with Greg Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.